under the fluorescent lights, and her natural hair was styled in loose curls that framed her face. She wore a simple yellow dress that made her look like sunshine itself. But it was the small crescent-shaped birthmark on her left wrist that made Jonathan's breath catch in his throat. "Daddy, look. That's Miss Washington. She reads us stories every Tuesday." Grace pressed her small face against the car window, her breath fogging the glass. Her twin brother Gabriel bounced in his car seat beside her. "She's really nice, Daddy. She always helps us with our reading," Gabriel added, his voice filled with innocent admiration. "And she smells like vanilla cookies." Jonathan's chest tightened. His children, his own flesh and blood, were talking about their mother like she was a stranger. Grace and Gabriel had been only 3 when Simone disappeared. The courts had eventually granted him full custody when she never responded to legal notices, but he had never stopped wondering if she was alive, if she was safe, if she ever thought about the children she had left behind. How could she be here working at their school, seeing his children every week and never once trying to contact him? How could she read stories to other people's children while her own kids grew up calling another woman their caregiver? The rain drummed harder against the windshield as Jonathan watched Simone close the book and smile at the children. That smile. He had fallen in love with that smile when they were both 26, working late nights at his startup company. She had been his accountant, his voice of reason, and eventually his wife. When the twins were born, she had quit her job to stay home with them, claiming she wanted to give them the childhood she never had. Then everything changed. Jonathan's business grew rapidly, and with success came unwanted attention. Competitors, hostile takeover attempts, and threatening phone calls to their home. Simone had grown increasingly paranoid, convinced that someone was watching their family. She begged him to sell the company and move somewhere safe. When he refused, saying he had worked too hard to give up now, she accused him of caring more about money than his family's safety. The next morning, Jonathan had awakened to an empty house and a note on the kitchen counter. "I have to protect them. Don't look for us. When it's safe, I'll bring them home. I love you." But she never came home. The police found no trace of her or the children. Private investigators turned up nothing. Jonathan had spent 2 years in agony, building his company into a tech empire while his heart remained broken. Then, like a miracle, the twins were found in a children's shelter 3 states away. Simone had left them there with a note claiming she could no longer care for them and requesting they be placed with their father. That was 9 months ago. Grace and Gabriel had adjusted well to their new life, but they remembered very little about their mother. They called Mrs. Patterson their elderly nanny, Grammy, and seemed content with their routine. Jonathan had tried to explain that they once had a mommy who loved them very much but had to go away, but the children showed little interest in learning more. Now here she was, close enough to touch, and his children saw her only as the kind teacher who read them stories. "Can we go inside now, Daddy?" Grace asked, tugging on his sleeve. "Miss Washington said she has a new book about a lost puppy who finds his family." The irony was not lost on Jonathan. A lost puppy finding his family. He looked at his beautiful children, their faces innocent and hopeful, and felt his world tilt on its axis. Should he march into that classroom and confront Simone? Should he demand answers about why she abandoned them? Should he call his lawyer? Or should he simply drive away and pretend he never saw her? But looking at Grace and Gabriel's excited faces, Jonathan knew he could not run. His children deserved to know their mother, and Simone deserved to know what amazing little people they had become. Whatever had driven her away 3 years ago, whatever fears had made her leave, they would have to face the truth together. As he turned off the engine and prepared to walk into the school, Jonathan wondered if his children would recognize their mother when they saw her up close. And more importantly, he wondered if he was ready to forgive the woman who had broken his heart but was clearly still the love of his life. The rain continued to fall as the Hayes family prepared to step back into their past, not knowing that the simple act of walking through those school doors would change everything forever. What would you do if you discovered the person your children loved most was the one who had hurt your family the deepest? Would you risk your heart again for the chance to heal old wounds? Subscribe to find out how this impossible situation unfolds, and let me know in the comments what you think Jonathan should do. 3 weeks before that life-changing moment in the school parking lot, 6-year-old Grace Hayes sat cross-legged on the marble floor of her father's corner office on the 32nd floor of Hayes Technology Tower. She was supposed to be coloring in her Disney princess book while Gabriel built castles with his magnetic blocks, but instead she found herself studying her daddy's face. Jonathan sat behind his massive oak desk, talking to someone on his wireless headset about quarterly reports and market projections. His dark brown hair was perfectly styled, his navy blue suit was expensive and well-fitted, and his green eyes were sharp with intelligence. But Grace noticed the way his shoulders sagged when he thought no one was looking. She saw how he rubbed his temples when he was tired. Most importantly, she noticed that he never smiled the way other daddies did when they picked up their children from school. "Gabriel," she whispered to her twin brother, "do you think Daddy is lonely?" Gabriel looked up from his castle, his identical green eyes serious. Even though they were the same age, Gabriel often acted like the older brother, protective and thoughtful. "Why do you ask?" "Mrs. Patterson says lonely people need hugs and cookies to feel better. But Daddy gets lots of hugs from us and Mrs. Patterson makes cookies every day. He still looks sad sometimes." Gabriel abandoned his blocks and crawled over to sit beside his sister. Together, they watched their father end his phone call and immediately pick up another folder from his desk. He had not looked at them once in the past 20 minutes. "Maybe he needs a different kind of hug," Gabriel said quietly. "Like the kind Mommy Sarah gives Emma at school or the kind Mommy Jennifer gives Tyler." Grace nodded. They had noticed that their classmates had both mommies and daddies, while they only had Daddy and Mrs. Patterson. When they asked Jonathan about having a mommy, he always got that faraway look in his eyes and said their first mommy had loved them very much but had to go to heaven. Grayson. Gabriel accepted this explanation, but they also noticed that other children's mommies were very much alive and living in their houses. "Do you think we could find Daddy a new mommy?" Grace asked, her voice full of hope. "Like a surprise present?" Gabriel's eyes lit up with excitement. "Exactly. We could look for someone really nice who would make Daddy smile all the time." Their conversation was interrupted when Rebecca Chin, Jonathan's assistant, knocked on the office door. She was a petite woman with straight black hair and kind eyes who always brought them juice boxes and crackers when they visited the office. "Mr. Hayes, your 4 o'clock meeting has been moved to tomorrow," Rebecca said, poking her head through the door. "Also, your mother called. She wants to know if you're bringing anyone to your cousin's wedding next month." Jonathan sighed and pulled off his headset. "Tell my mother I'll attend alone as usual. She also mentioned that your cousin specifically asked about your dating life. Apparently, the whole family is concerned that you work too much and never take time for yourself." "My family needs to mind their own business," Jonathan replied, but his tone was not angry, just tired. "My children and my company are all I need." Rebecca smiled gently. "With respect, Mr. Hayes, everyone needs companionship. Even successful CEOs deserve happiness." After Rebecca left, Grace and Gabriel exchanged meaningful looks. Their plan was definitely needed. "Daddy," Grace climbed onto Jonathan's lap, something that always made him stop working immediately. "Do you ever wish you had someone to talk to when we're sleeping?" Jonathan wrapped his arms around both children, pulling Gabriel close as well. "What do you mean, sweetheart? Like, when you eat dinner after we go to bed, do you wish someone was sitting with you?" Gabriel nodded enthusiastically. "Mrs. Patterson says grown-ups like to have grown-up conversations about grown-up things." Jonathan studied his children's faces, sensing they were leading somewhere with these questions. "Sometimes, I suppose. But I have you too, and that makes me happier than anything in the world." "But what about when we grow up and move away to college?" Grace asked, having learned about college from watching movies. "Who will take care of you then?" The question hit Jonathan harder than he expected. He had not thought much about dating since gaining custody of the twins. His days were consumed with learning how to braid Grace's hair, attending Gabriel's soccer games, and making sure they both felt loved and secure. Romance seemed like a luxury he could not afford. "I suppose I never really thought about it," he admitted honestly. "Maybe you should think about it," Gabriel suggested with the wisdom that sometimes surprised adults. "Because if you found someone really nice who loved you and loved us too, then we could be a bigger family. And bigger families have more people to hug," Grace added, as if this was the most logical conclusion in the world. That evening, after Mrs. Patterson had given the twins their baths and tucked them into bed, Jonathan found himself standing on the balcony of his penthouse apartment, looking out at the city lights. His children's words echoed in his mind. When had he become so focused on work that he forgot about his own happiness? The truth was he had loved once, deeply and completely. Simone had been his everything, his partner in business and in life. When she left, taking their children, she had taken his ability to trust, to hope, to believe in love. Even after getting Grace and Gabriel back, he had built walls around his heart, telling himself that being a good father was enough. But watching his children's innocent faces today, seeing their concern for his well-being, Jonathan realized that perhaps he had been cheating them out of something important. They deserved to see what a loving partnership looked like. They deserved a mother figure who could give them things he could not. And maybe, just maybe, he deserved a second chance at love. Little did Jonathan know that his 6-year-old children were already formulating a plan that would change their lives in ways none of them could imagine. In their shared bedroom, Grace and Gabriel whispered excitedly about their secret mission, finding the perfect woman to make their daddy smile again. They had no idea that the perfect woman was closer than they ever could have guessed. The next morning, Grace and Gabriel huddled under Grace's princess comforter with a notebook, 3 colored pencils, and a serious mission. Mrs. Patterson was downstairs making breakfast, and their father was already at the office, which gave them perfect planning time. "Okay," Grace said, opening the notebook to a fresh page. "We need to make a list of everything Daddy needs in a wife." Gabriel held the purple pencil like it was a very important business pen. "She has to be really nice." Grace wrote nice in big uneven letters. "And pretty. And she has to like kids," Gabriel added, watching his sister write, "likes kids" below the first item. "She should smell good like flowers or cookies," Grace continued, adding smells good to their list. Gabriel thought for a moment. "She needs to be smart because Daddy talks about smart things all the time." "Smart," joined the growing list. "And she should make Daddy laugh," Grace said, remembering how rarely their father smiled. "Makes Daddy laugh." The twins spent the next 30 minutes adding items like, "good hugger," "knows how to braid hair," and "likes storybooks." When they were finished, they had a list of 15 requirements for their father's future wife. "Now we need to find her," Gabriel said, studying their masterpiece. "Where do grown-ups meet other grown-ups?" Grace asked, genuinely puzzled by this aspect of adult life. Gabriel shrugged. "Maybe at the grocery store? Daddy goes there sometimes. Or at our school. There are lots of nice ladies at school." This was how Operation Find Daddy Love began in earnest. Over the next week, Grace and Gabriel became tiny detectives, studying every woman who crossed their path. They evaluated the cashier at the grocery store, nice but did not smell like flowers, their pediatrician, smart but too serious, and even Rebecca from their father's office, perfect except she was already married. Their first official attempt at matchmaking happened at the Children's Museum. Jonathan had taken them for their monthly educational outing, and the twins spotted their target immediately, a beautiful woman with curly red hair who was supervising a group of children near the dinosaur exhibit. "Daddy," Grace tugged on Jonathan's hand, "that lady looks lonely." Jonathan glanced over at the woman, who was clearly a teacher or group leader, definitely not lonely. "She looks busy to me, sweetheart." "Maybe you should go talk to her," Gabriel suggested with the subtlety of a 6-year-old. "You could ask her about dinosaurs." "Why would I ask her about dinosaurs?" "Because you like learning new things," Grace said earnestly. "And maybe she likes learning new things too." Jonathan studied his children's hopeful faces and suddenly understood what was happening. "Are you two trying to set me up on a date?" Both children looked at each other, realizing they had been caught. "We just think you might like having a friend," Gabriel said carefully. "A special grown-up friend," Grace clarified. Jonathan knelt down to their level, touched by their concern but also amused. "That's very sweet of you both, but finding friends is something grown-ups have to do for themselves." "But what if you're too busy to look?" Grace asked with perfect child logic. "What if the perfect person is right here and you don't see her because you're thinking about work?" Gabriel added. Their father had to admit they had a point. He was always thinking about work. Even now, surrounded by dinosaur skeletons and excited children, part of his mind was reviewing the presentation he had to give on Monday morning. "Tell you what," Jonathan said, standing up and taking their hands. "If I promise to pay more attention to the people around me, will you promise to let me handle my own dating life?" "Can we give you suggestions?" Grace asked hopefully. "Small suggestions," Gabriel clarified. Jonathan laughed, the first genuine laugh his children had heard from him in weeks. "Very small suggestions." But Grace and Gabriel had no intention of giving up their mission. They simply decided to be more sneaky about it. The next phase of Operation Find Daddy Love involved their school. During recess, they interviewed their female teachers about their personal lives. Miss Rodriguez, their kindergarten teacher, was already married. Mrs. Thompson from 2nd grade was very nice but had 3 cats, and Gabriel was allergic to cats. Miss Kim from the art room was perfect in every way except she was planning to move to California in the summer. "This is harder than we thought," Grace said as they swung side by side on the playground swings. "Maybe we're looking in the wrong places," Gabriel suggested. "Maybe we need to think about where Daddy goes when he's not working." Grace brightened. "He goes to our school sometimes. 4 parent meetings and school plays. And the coffee shop next to his office building. I saw him there once when Mrs. Patterson took us to visit. And the bookstore. Remember when he bought us those new chapter books? They were building a new strategy when their classmate Emma ran over to them. Grace, Gabriel, guess what? Miss Washington is going to start reading stories to our class every Tuesday, Emma announced excitedly. My mom says she's the nicest teacher in the whole school. Who's Miss Washington? Gabriel asked. She teaches 4th grade, but she volunteers to read to younger kids because she loves stories so much. And she's really pretty, like a princess. Grace and Gabriel looked at each other with growing excitement. A teacher who loved stories, was nice, and looked like a princess sounded exactly like what their daddy needed. Does she smell good? Grace asked seriously. Emma giggled. She smells like vanilla and books. That afternoon, the twins peppered Mrs. Patterson with questions about Miss Washington while she drove them home from school. Oh, Simone is lovely, Mrs. Patterson said, navigating through downtown traffic. I met her at the school orientation. She's been teaching for 3 years and all the children adore her. She has such a gentle way about her. Is she married? Gabriel asked innocently. Mrs. Patterson glanced at him in the rearview mirror. Why do you ask? Just wondering, Grace said quickly. Does she like kids? Well, she's a teacher, dear. Of course she likes children. The twins spent the rest of the car ride plotting how to get their father to meet the mysterious Miss Washington. They did not know that their questions had planted a seed of curiosity in Mrs. Patterson's mind, or that she was already forming her own plans to help her lonely employer find happiness. That night, as Jonathan tucked them into bed, Grace and Gabriel were practically vibrating with excitement about their new discovery. Daddy, Grace said as he pulled her covers up to her chin, do you like stories? I love stories. You know that. What about ladies who read stories to children? Jonathan paused, his hands smoothing Gabriel's hair. That sounds like a very nice person to be. We think so too, Gabriel said sleepily. As their father kissed them goodnight and turned off the lights, Grace and Gabriel smiled in the darkness. Phase 2 of Operation Find Daddy Love was about to begin, and they had found their perfect candidate. They just needed to figure out how to get Daddy to notice the story lady. Tuesday morning arrived with unusual excitement in the Hayes household. Grace and Gabriel had barely slept, too eager to finally meet Miss Washington and evaluate her potential as their father's future wife. They dressed themselves carefully, with Grace choosing her favorite yellow dress because yellow is a happy color, and Gabriel wearing his button-down shirt that made him look more serious. Mrs. Patterson noticed their unusual behavior during breakfast. You two are certainly energetic this morning. What's the special occasion? Miss Washington is reading to our class today, Grace explained, spreading strawberry jam on her toast with extra care. We want to make a good impression, Gabriel added solemnly. A good impression? Mrs. Patterson raised an eyebrow. She's reading you a story, not interviewing you for a job. The twins exchanged glances. If only Mrs. Patterson knew that this was exactly like a job interview, except they were the ones doing the interviewing. When they arrived at Lincoln Elementary, Grace and Gabriel could barely contain their excitement. They had prepared a list of questions to ask Miss Washington, carefully disguised as innocent children's curiosity. They needed to know if she liked coffee because Daddy drank coffee every morning, if she enjoyed business movies because Daddy watched those on weekends, and if she thought working hard was important because Daddy worked very hard. Their teacher, Miss Rodriguez, had arranged the reading circle in the corner of the classroom with colorful cushions and a small wooden chair for their guest reader. At exactly 10 o'clock, there was a gentle knock on the classroom door. Children, please welcome Miss Washington, Miss Rodriguez announced. The door opened and Grace felt her breath catch in her throat. Miss Washington was indeed beautiful, just as Emma had promised. She had warm brown skin that seemed to glow under the classroom lights, and her hair was styled in soft curls that framed her face perfectly. She wore a flowing blue dress and carried a large canvas bag filled with books. But it was her smile that made Grace's heart skip a beat. It was the warmest, most genuine smile she had ever seen. Good morning, everyone, Miss Washington said, her voice like honey and music combined. I'm so excited to share some wonderful stories with you today. Gabriel nudged his sister as they settled onto their cushions. Miss Washington definitely passed the looks like a princess test. Our first story is about a little owl who was afraid of the dark, Miss Washington continued, pulling a beautifully illustrated book from her bag. But sometimes the things that scare us the most can become our greatest adventures. As she began to read, Grace and Gabriel found themselves completely captivated. Miss Washington did not just read the words, she brought them to life. She changed her voice for different characters, made sound effects, and encouraged the children to participate in the story. When the little owl discovered that darkness was not scary but magical, filled with friendly creatures and twinkling stars, the entire class applauded. "Now," Miss Washington said, closing the book, "who can tell me about a time when they were scared of something but then discovered it was not so frightening after all?" Several hands shot up, and Miss Washington listened patiently to each story, asking thoughtful questions and offering gentle encouragement. Grace noticed that she never interrupted anyone and always found something positive to say about each child's experience. When story time ended, Grace approached Miss Washington with Gabriel close behind. "Miss Washington," Grace said politely, "that was the best story I've ever heard." "Thank you, sweetheart. What's your name?" "I'm Grace and this is my twin brother Gabriel. We're 6 years old." "It's wonderful to meet you both," Miss Washington said, kneeling down to their level. Up close, Grace could see that her eyes were the color of warm chocolate and held a kindness that reminded her of something she could not quite place. "Miss Washington," Gabriel said, launching into their prepared questions, "do you like coffee?" She laughed, a musical sound that made both children smile. "I do like coffee. Why do you ask?" "Just wondering," Grace said quickly. "Do you watch movies?" "Sometimes. I especially like movies with happy endings." The twins looked at each other with growing excitement. "Coffee, check. Movies, check. Do you think working hard is important?" Gabriel continued their interview. Miss Washington tilted her head, studying them with curious eyes. "I think working hard at things you care about is very important. But I also think it's important to make time for the people you love." Perfect answer. Grace could hardly contain her excitement. "Do you have a family?" Grace asked innocently. For just a moment, something sad flickered across Miss Washington's face, but it was gone so quickly that the children almost missed it. "I have my students," she said gently. "All of you are like family to me. But don't you want your own kids someday?" Gabriel pressed, with the directness that only children can manage. Miss Washington was quiet for a moment, her fingers absently touching a silver locket at her throat. "I think having children would be the most wonderful thing in the world." That afternoon, Grace and Gabriel could talk about nothing else. During their ride home with Mrs. Patterson, they chattered excitedly about Miss Washington's storytelling, her pretty dress, and how nice she smelled, vanilla, just as Emma had promised. "She's perfect, Mrs. Patterson," Grace declared from her car seat. "She likes coffee and movies and thinks working hard is important. And she wants to have children," Gabriel added significantly. Mrs. Patterson glanced at them in the rearview mirror, beginning to understand the direction of their thoughts. "She sounds lovely, but why are these things so important to you?" "No reason," both children said in unison, which immediately made Mrs. Patterson suspicious. That evening after dinner, the twins retreated to their playroom to update their notebook. They drew a picture of Miss Washington next to their list of requirements and put check marks next to every item she had fulfilled. "Now we just have to get Daddy to meet her," Grace said, tapping her purple crayon against her lips thoughtfully. "But how?" Gabriel asked. "It's not like we can just bring her home for dinner." Grace's eyes suddenly lit up with inspiration. "What if Daddy had to come to school for something important? Like a parent meeting or a school event? Or what if we had a problem that only Daddy could solve, and it happened to be during Miss Washington's story time?" They were interrupted by Jonathan's arrival home from work. He looked tired but happy to see them, loosening his tie as he sat down on the floor beside their art supplies. "How was school today?" he asked, pulling them both close for their evening hug. "Amazing," Grace said dreamily. "Miss Washington read us the most beautiful story about a brave little owl. She's the best story reader in the whole world," Gabriel added. "You should meet her, Daddy." Jonathan smiled at their enthusiasm. "She sounds very special." "She is," Grace said seriously. "I think you would really like her." "And I think she would really like you too," Gabriel said with the confidence of a child who believed his father was the most wonderful man in the world. Jonathan studied their faces, recognizing the familiar gleam in their eyes that usually meant they were plotting something. "Why do I have the feeling you two are up to something?" "We're always up to something," Grace said with innocent eyes. "That's what kids do." That night, after the twins were asleep, Jonathan found himself wondering about the mysterious Miss Washington who had captured his children's imagination so completely. It had been a long time since he had seen them so excited about anyone new in their lives. Maybe he should make an effort to meet their teachers, to be more involved in their school activities. He had no way of knowing that his children were already planning the perfect opportunity for that meeting, or that Miss Washington was lying awake in her own apartment just a few miles away, thinking about two beautiful children who had reminded her so strongly of the babies she had once held in her arms. The universe was conspiring to bring the Hayes family back together, guided by the innocent determination of two 6-year-olds who just wanted their daddy to be happy. 2 weeks later, Grace and Gabriel's patience was rewarded in the most unexpected way. They were sitting in the school library during lunch period, trying to think of new ways to get their father to school, when Principal Martinez made an announcement over the intercom. Attention all students and families. This Friday evening, we will be hosting our annual family reading night in the school gymnasium. Parents and children are invited to enjoy stories, crafts, and refreshments together. We hope to see everyone there for this special community event. Grace and Gabriel looked at each other with identical expressions of pure joy. This was perfect. Better than perfect. This was destiny. Daddy has to come, Grace whispered excitedly. It's a family event. And Miss Washington will definitely be there because she loves reading stories, Gabriel added, practically bouncing in his chair. They spent the rest of the week carefully planning their strategy. They would need to make sure their father understood how important this event was to them. They would need to arrive early enough to secure good seats near wherever Miss Washington would be reading. Most importantly, they would need to find a way to introduce their father to Miss Washington without making it obvious that they had planned the whole thing. On Friday evening, Jonathan found himself driving toward Lincoln Elementary with a car full of excited children and Mrs. Patterson, who had volunteered to help supervise the twins during the event. Now remember, Grace said from her car seat, we have to find good seats right away. And we should stay for the whole event, Gabriel added. It would be rude to leave early. Jonathan smiled at their enthusiasm. Don't worry, we'll stay as long as you want. I'm looking forward to meeting your teachers and seeing what all the excitement is about. The school gymnasium had been transformed into a cozy reading wonderland. Colorful banners hung from the ceiling, and various reading stations were set up around the room. Parents and children moved between stations, listening to stories, making bookmarks, and enjoying homemade cookies and punch. Grace and Gabriel immediately spotted Miss Washington near the far corner of the gym, where she had created an elaborate storytelling area complete with a comfortable armchair, soft lighting, and a collection of picture books displayed on easels. She was wearing a flowing green dress that made her look like a fairy tale princess, and her warm smile drew families toward her like a magnet. There she is, Grace whispered, tugging on her father's hand. That's Miss Washington. Jonathan followed his daughter's gaze and felt his heart stop. Even from across the crowded gymnasium, even after 3 years of separation and pain, he would know that silhouette anywhere. The way she moved her hands when she spoke. The tilt of her head when she listened. The graceful way she knelt down to talk to children at their eye level. Was Simone. Is Simone. The woman who had disappeared with his children and broken his heart into a million pieces. Daddy, are you okay? Gabriel asked, noticing that his father had gone very still and pale. Jonathan forced himself to breathe. This was impossible. What were the odds that Simone would be working at his children's school? That she would be the beloved Miss Washington his children had been talking about for weeks? I'm fine, he managed to say, though his voice sounded strange even to his own ears. Let's go listen to the story. As they moved closer to Miss Washington's reading area, Jonathan's mind raced with questions and emotions. Did she know Grace and Gabriel were her children? Had she been watching them all this time? Was this some elaborate plan to get back into their lives? But as they found seats on the carpet near her chair, Jonathan forced himself to really look at the woman he had once loved so completely. She looked older, more mature. There were tiny lines around her eyes that had not been there before, and a sadness in her expression that she tried to hide behind her professional smile. She wore no wedding ring, and when she moved, he caught a glimpse of the silver locket she had always worn, the one that contained a picture of them on their wedding day. Miss Washington began reading a story about a family of bears who got separated in a forest but never stopped looking for each other. Her voice was exactly as Jonathan remembered, soft and musical, with a rhythm that had once lulled him to sleep on difficult nights. Grace and Gabriel listened with rapt attention, completely unaware of the drama unfolding between the adults. They were focused entirely on their plan to get their father to notice how wonderful Miss Washington was. As the story continued, Jonathan found himself studying his children's reactions to Simone's voice, looking for any sign of recognition. But Grace and Gabriel showed no indication that they remembered their mother. They simply enjoyed the story like any other children would. When Miss Washington finished reading, she closed the book and smiled at her audience. Now, who would like to share what they thought about the Bear family's adventure? Several hands shot up, and she called on each child patiently, giving them her full attention. Jonathan watched, fascinated despite himself as she interacted with the children. She was natural with them, gentle and encouraging, in a way that spoke of genuine love for her students. Miss Washington, Grace raised her hand eagerly, I think the Bear family was really brave to keep looking for each other. That's a wonderful observation, Grace. Why do you think it was brave? Because sometimes when you're looking for someone you love, you might be scared you'll never find them. But they kept trying anyway. Simone's eyes filled with tears, though she quickly blinked them away. You're absolutely right, sweetheart. Love makes us brave even when we're afraid. Gabriel raised his hand next. Miss Washington, do you think the Bear family will stay together forever now that they found each other? I hope so, Simone said softly, her gaze unconsciously drifting to Jonathan's face. For one heart-stopping moment, their eyes met across the circle of children. Jonathan saw the exact instant when recognition hit her. Her face went white, and her hand flew to her throat, touching the silver locket. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. Miss Washington? A little boy asked. Are you okay? Simone forced herself to look away from Jonathan and back at the children. I'm fine, sweetie. Just thinking about how happy endings make me emotional sometimes. The reading session ended shortly after, with families moving on to other activities. Jonathan stood slowly, his legs unsteady, unsure of what to do next. Should he approach her? Should he take the children and leave immediately? Should he demand answers? The decision was made for him when Grace and Gabriel grabbed his hands and started pulling him toward Miss Washington. Come on, Daddy, Grace said excitedly. We want you to meet Miss Washington properly. She's the one we told you about, Gabriel added, the one who reads the best stories. Jonathan found himself being dragged across the gym toward the woman who had once been his wife, guided by the innocent enthusiasm of the children they had created together. As they approached, Simone stood frozen by her chair, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear, longing, and something that might have been hope. Miss Washington, Grace announced proudly, this is our daddy, Mr. Hayes. Simone's hand trembled as she extended it toward Jonathan. Mr. Hayes. It's very nice to meet you. Jonathan took her hand, and the familiar warmth of her skin sent shockwaves through his entire body. Miss Washington, he said carefully, the pleasure is mine. For a moment, they stood there holding hands while their children beamed up at them, completely unaware that they had just orchestrated the reunion of their parents after 3 years of separation and heartbreak. The future had never been more uncertain, but one thing was clear. Grace and Gabriel's plan to find their father a wife had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. They just did not know it yet. Can love truly conquer the pain of betrayal? Will Jonathan find it in his heart to forgive the woman who abandoned their family? And how will Grace and Gabriel react when they learn the truth about their beloved Miss Washington? Subscribe to discover how this emotional reunion unfolds, and tell me in the comments, do you think Simone deserves a second chance? The handshake lasted only a few seconds, but to Jonathan and Simone, it felt like an eternity. Neither wanted to be the first to let go, and neither knew what to say with their children watching so expectantly. Daddy, Grace said, breaking the spell, did you know Miss Washington teaches 4th grade and volunteers to read to all the younger kids? She's really smart, Gabriel added helpfully. And she knows about everything. Books and animals and even science stuff. Jonathan forced himself to release Simone's hand and focus on his children's excited faces. That's very impressive. Mr. Hayes, Simone said, her voice slightly shaky, Grace and Gabriel have mentioned you several times. They're very proud of their father. Have they? Jonathan's eyebrows rose. He had no idea his children talked about him during story time. Oh yes, Simone smiled, though there were tears gathering in her eyes. They told me you work very hard to take care of them and that you make the best pancakes in the world. Gabriel giggled. That's because he puts chocolate chips in them. And sometimes he puts whipped cream on top, Grace added. He says special occasions deserve special pancakes. Jonathan found himself studying Simone's face as she listened to their children. Her expression was one of pure love and longing, as if she was memorizing every word. When Gabriel mentioned the chocolate chip pancakes, she smiled in a way that reached her eyes, and Jonathan remembered how she used to make the same pancakes for him on Sunday mornings when they were first married. Miss Washington, Gabriel said suddenly, do you like pancakes? I love pancakes, she replied honestly. They're one of my favorite breakfast foods. Grace clapped her hands together. Daddy, maybe you could make pancakes for Miss Washington sometime. Both adults froze. Jonathan could see the panic in Simone's eyes and the hope warring with fear in her expression. That's very kind of you to suggest, sweetheart, Jonathan said carefully, but Miss Washington probably has her own weekend plans. Actually, Simone said quietly, surprising herself with her boldness, I don't have many weekend plans these days. I spend most of my free time reading or preparing lessons. See, Grace said triumphantly. She needs more fun in her life. Mrs. Patterson, who had been watching this interaction from a few feet away, approached their group with a knowing smile. Mr. Hayes, the children have been talking about Miss Washington for weeks. They seem quite taken with her. Mrs. Patterson, Gabriel said excitedly, this is Miss Washington. Isn't she pretty? Very pretty, Mrs. Patterson agreed, studying Simone with interest. And you have such a gentle way with the children. Have you always wanted to be a teacher? Simone hesitated for a moment. I actually started in business, but I discovered that working with children brings me more joy than anything else. Jonathan's head snapped up at this revelation. Simone had been his accountant when they met, brilliant with numbers and business strategy. The idea that she had left the corporate world to teach elementary school was something he never would have expected. What made you change careers? He asked, genuinely curious despite the awkwardness of the situation. I realized that success means different things to different people, Simone said, her eyes meeting his briefly. Some people find fulfillment in building companies and making money. Others find it in nurturing young minds and helping children discover their potential. There was no accusation in her words, but Jonathan heard the implication. During their marriage, she had often suggested he was too focused on financial success at the expense of family time. It seemed that in the years since their separation, she had chosen a completely different path. Both paths have value, he said diplomatically. Of course they do, Simone agreed. I didn't mean to imply otherwise. An uncomfortable silence fell over the group until Grace, with the social awareness of a 6-year-old, broke the tension. Miss Washington, would you like to see the bookmark we made at the craft station? I would love to see it. As Grace and Gabriel led Simone toward their craft table, Mrs. Patterson fell into step beside Jonathan. She seems lovely, the older woman said conversationally. Yes, Jonathan replied, watching Simone admire his children's artwork with genuine enthusiasm. The children clearly adore her. I've never seen them so excited about a teacher. Jonathan nodded, unsure of how to respond. Mr. Hayes, Mrs. Patterson said gently, forgive me for being forward, but when was the last time you saw the children this animated about introducing you to someone new? The question hit him like a physical blow. The truth was, Grace and Gabriel had never shown interest in his social life before. They had never asked about dating or expressed concern about his loneliness. Their sudden fascination with Miss Washington was completely out of character, unless you think they're trying to play matchmaker, he said slowly. Mrs. Patterson smiled. I think your children love you very much and want you to be happy. And I think Miss Washington might be exactly the kind of person who could make that possible. Jonathan watched as Simone knelt beside Gabriel, helping him add glitter to his bookmark while Grace chattered excitedly about the story they had just heard. She looked so natural with them, so comfortable and loving. For a moment, he could almost forget the pain of the past 3 years and imagine what it might be like to be a family again. But then reality crashed back in. This was the woman who had abandoned their children, who had disappeared without a trace and left him wondering if they were alive or dead, who had broken his heart so thoroughly that he had not been able to trust anyone since. How could he even consider forgiving her, let alone rekindling their relationship? Mr. Hayes, a voice interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see Simone approaching, with Grace and Gabriel skipping beside her. Miss Washington helped us make our bookmarks extra special, Grace announced, holding up a glittery creation shaped like a butterfly. They're beautiful, Jonathan said, examining their artwork. You're very talented teachers. Thank you, Simone said softly. They're wonderful students. You should be very proud. I am, Jonathan replied, meaning it completely. They're the best thing that ever happened to me. Something flickered across Simone's face at these words, an expression too complex for him to interpret. Daddy, Gabriel said, tugging on his father's sleeve, can we ask Miss Washington to have coffee with us tomorrow? You always say coffee is how grown-ups become friends. Jonathan's mouth fell open. He had never said any such thing, at least not in those words, but somehow his 6-year-old son had distilled adult social interactions down to their basic components. Gabriel, he started to protest, but Grace joined in the campaign. Please, Daddy? Miss Washington said she likes coffee and you drink coffee every day. You could be coffee friends. Both children looked at him with such hope and excitement that Jonathan found himself looking helplessly at Simone. I don't want to impose, she said quickly. I know you must be very busy with work and family responsibilities. It's just coffee, Gabriel said with the simple logic of childhood. How long can coffee take? Jonathan looked at his children's eager faces, then at Mrs. Patterson's encouraging nod, and finally at Simone's uncertain expression. Every rational part of his mind was screaming that this was a mistake, that he should take his children and leave, that he should protect his heart from the woman who had already broken it once. But looking at Grace and Gabriel, seeing how much this meant to them, he found himself saying, "Coffee sounds nice. There's a cafe downtown that's very family-friendly. Would tomorrow afternoon work for you?" Simone's face lit up with genuine joy. Tomorrow afternoon would be perfect. As they exchanged phone numbers and made plans to meet, Jonathan wondered what he was getting himself into. But watching his children's excitement, seeing their faces glow with happiness at having successfully brought together their father and their favorite teacher, he decided that maybe taking a chance on coffee was worth the risk. After all, what was the worst thing that could happen? He had no idea that within 24 hours, his entire world would be turned upside down once again. Saturday afternoon found Jonathan sitting in Brewster's cafe, nervously checking his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. Grace and Gabriel sat across from him at the small round table, coloring in the children's placemats the restaurant provided while chattering excitedly about Miss Washington's impending arrival. "Remember, Daddy," Grace said seriously, not looking up from her drawing of a purple elephant, "you should ask her questions about herself. People like it when you're interested in them. And don't talk about work the whole time," Gabriel added, carefully coloring inside the lines of a sailing ship. "Mrs. Patterson says ladies don't like it when men only talk about business." Jonathan almost choked on his coffee. "When did Mrs. Patterson tell you that?" "Last week when we asked her how people fall in love," Grace replied matter-of-factly. "You asked her what?" Before either child could answer, the cafe door chimed and Simone walked in. She had changed from her green dress into jeans and a soft lavender sweater that made her skin glow. Her hair was loose around her shoulders and she carried a small purse and a book. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. She looked exactly like the woman he had fallen in love with 8 years ago, but somehow even more beautiful. "Miss Washington," Grace called out, waving enthusiastically. "Over here." Simone approached their table with a nervous smile. "Thank you for inviting me. I hope I'm not intruding on your family time." "Not at all," Jonathan said, standing to pull out her chair. "We're happy you could join us." As Simone sat down, Gabriel immediately launched into conversation. "Miss Washington, do you have any pets?" "I have a cat named Whiskers," she replied, settling into her seat. "He's orange and white and thinks he's much braver than he actually is." "We don't have any pets yet," Grace said wistfully. "Daddy says maybe when we're older." Jonathan felt a pang of guilt. The children had asked for a dog several times, but he had been too busy with work to consider adding a pet to their household routine. "Pets are a big responsibility," Simone said gently, "but they can also bring a lot of joy to a family." A waitress approached to take Simone's order, and Jonathan found himself studying her face as she interacted with the server. She was polite and friendly, asking about the daily specials and deciding on herbal tea instead of coffee because caffeine makes me too jittery in the afternoon. "Miss Washington," Gabriel said as soon as the waitress left, "what's your favorite thing about being a teacher?" Simone's face lit up. "My favorite thing is watching children discover something new about themselves. Like when a student who thinks they hate reading finds a book they can't put down, or when someone who's afraid to speak up in class suddenly raises their hand to share an idea." "That's exactly what happened to Tommy Martinez," Grace said excitedly. "He used to be really quiet, but now he always wants to answer questions during story time." "Tommy is a perfect example," Simone agreed. "He just needed to find his confidence." Jonathan listened to this exchange with growing amazement. This was a side of Simone he had never seen before. During their marriage, she had been focused on business and financial planning. He had never known she had such insight into children's emotional development or such passion for education. "What made you want to become a teacher?" he asked. Simone was quiet for a moment, her fingers absently touching the silver locket at her throat. "I think I always knew I wanted to work with children, but it took me a while to find the courage to pursue that dream. Sometimes we have to lose everything we think we want before we discover what we actually need." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that the children couldn't understand but that hit Jonathan like a physical blow. "Have you always lived here in the city?" he asked, trying to steer the conversation to safer ground. "No, I moved here about 2 years ago," Simone replied carefully. "I needed a fresh start." Grace and Gabriel exchanged glances. This was exactly the kind of grown-up conversation they had hoped to facilitate. "Do you like it here?" Gabriel asked. "I do now," Simone said, smiling at both children. "Especially since I started teaching at Lincoln Elementary. My students make every day better." The afternoon passed more quickly than any of them expected. Simone was easy to talk to, asking thoughtful questions about Jonathan's business without seeming impressed by his success or uninterested in the details. She laughed at Gabriel's jokes and listened seriously to Grace's stories about her best friend Emma. Most importantly, she made both children feel heard and valued in a way that came naturally to her. Jonathan found himself relaxing despite his initial nervousness. Whatever else had happened between them, whatever pain lay in their shared past, Simone was genuinely wonderful with his children. He could see why Grace and Gabriel had been so eager for him to meet her. "Miss Washington," Grace said as they were finishing their drinks, "do you ever get lonely living by yourself?" Simone's expression grew thoughtful. "Sometimes I do, sweetheart. But I've learned that being alone doesn't always mean being lonely. I have my students, my books, and Whiskers to keep me company. But wouldn't it be nicer to have a family?" Gabriel asked with the directness of childhood. "I think having a family would be wonderful," Simone said softly, her eyes briefly meeting Jonathan's. "But families come in many different forms. Some people find their families through marriage and children. Others create families with close friends or communities. The important thing is finding people who love and support you." Jonathan was struck by the maturity of her answer. The Simone he had known before would have given a much more traditional response about marriage and biological children. This new version of her seemed to understand that love and connection could take many forms. "We should probably be heading home," Jonathan said eventually, noticing that the cafe was getting busier with the late afternoon crowd. "The children have homework to finish." "Of course," Simone said, gathering her purse and book. "Thank you so much for inviting me. I had a wonderful time. Can we do this again next week?" Grace asked hopefully. Jonathan and Simone looked at each other uncertainly. "Maybe we could all go to the park next Saturday," Gabriel suggested. "Miss Washington could bring Whiskers and we could have a picnic." "Cats don't usually enjoy picnics," Simone said with a laugh, "but I think a park visit sounds lovely." As they walked out of the cafe together, Jonathan found himself genuinely looking forward to spending more time with Simone. Despite everything that had happened between them, despite all the unanswered questions and unresolved pain, she made him feel something he had not experienced in 3 years: hope. The children skipped ahead of them on the sidewalk, chattering excitedly about their successful matchmaking efforts. "They're wonderful kids," Simone said quietly as they watched Grace and Gabriel play a game of hopscotch on the sidewalk squares. "They are," Jonathan agreed. "They're the most important thing in my life." "You're a good father," Simone said, her voice thick with emotion. "They're lucky to have you." Jonathan looked at her sharply, hearing something in her tone that he couldn't quite identify. But before he could analyze it further, Gabriel came running back to them. "Daddy, Miss Washington, can we stop at the bookstore? I want to show Miss Washington the chapter books you bought us last week." And just like that, the moment was gone, replaced by the innocent enthusiasm of two children who had no idea they were orchestrating the reunion of their parents, one carefully planned outing at a time. As they headed toward the bookstore together, Jonathan couldn't help but smile. His children were certainly determined when they set their minds to something. He just hoped their matchmaking efforts wouldn't end in heartbreak for everyone involved. The following Saturday arrived with perfect spring weather, and Grace and Gabriel could barely contain their excitement about their park picnic with Miss Washington. They had spent the entire week planning what games they would play, what snacks they would bring, and how they could ensure their father and their favorite teacher had plenty of opportunities to talk. "Remember," Grace whispered to Gabriel as they packed their picnic basket, "we need to give them alone time to become friends." "But not too much alone time," Gabriel replied seriously. "We don't want them to get bored." Mrs. Patterson smiled as she listened to their planning session. Over the past week, she had watched Jonathan's mood improve dramatically. He was humming while he made coffee in the mornings, asking about the children's school activities with renewed interest, and even leaving work earlier to spend more time at home. "Mr. Hayes seems quite taken with Miss Washington," she mentioned to the twins as they helped her prepare sandwiches. "We think she's perfect for him," Grace said confidently. "She makes him smile in a different way." "A happy way," Gabriel clarified. "Like when he looks at us, but also like when he's proud of something at work." Mrs. Patterson was struck by the children's perceptiveness. They had indeed identified something special about the way their father looked at Simone, something that went beyond mere attraction or friendship. When they arrived at Riverside Park, Simone was already waiting near the playground, sitting on a bench and reading a book. She wore a flowing yellow sundress and sandals, and her hair was pulled back in a loose braid. She looked young and carefree in a way that reminded Jonathan painfully of their early dating days. "Miss Washington," Grace called out, running toward her with Gabriel close behind. Simone stood up and opened her arms, catching both children in a warm hug that looked completely natural. Jonathan felt his heart skip a beat at the sight. The three of them together looked like a family. "I brought a frisbee and a soccer ball," Gabriel announced proudly. "And Grace brought her jump rope. And Daddy brought his famous turkey sandwiches," Grace added. "He makes them with 3 different kinds of cheese." "That sounds delicious," Simone said, looking up at Jonathan as he approached with the picnic basket. "Thank you for organizing all of this." "Thank you for coming," he replied. "The kids have been talking about this all week." They found a perfect spot under a large oak tree, and Simone helped the children spread out the blanket while Jonathan unpacked their lunch. The easy domesticity of the moment was both comforting and heartbreaking. This was what he had always imagined their family life would be like, before everything went wrong. "Miss Washington," Gabriel said as they settled down to eat, "do you know how to play soccer?" "I played in college," she replied, accepting a sandwich from Jonathan. "I wasn't very good, but I enjoyed it." "You played soccer in college?" Jonathan asked, surprised. He had no idea Simone had been involved in sports during her university years. "Just intramural," she said modestly. "I needed something physical to balance out all the studying." Grace clapped her hands together. "You should play with us after lunch. Daddy's really good at soccer too." "I wouldn't say really good," Jonathan protested, but he was pleased that Grace wanted to show him off. After they finished eating, the children convinced both adults to join them in a game of family soccer. The teams were Grace and Jonathan versus Gabriel and Simone, and the competition quickly became lighthearted and silly. Simone turned out to be much better than she had claimed, easily keeping up with Gabriel's energetic playing style while Jonathan found himself holding back to give Grace a fair chance. "Goal!" Simone cheered as Gabriel managed to kick the ball past Jonathan's half-hearted defense. She swept the little boy up in a celebratory hug, spinning him around while he giggled with delight. Jonathan paused in his goalkeeping to watch them together. Gabriel's face was radiant with joy, and Simone looked happier than he had seen her since their reunion. There was something about the way she interacted with his son that seemed completely natural, as if she had been hugging him and celebrating his victories his entire life. "Daddy, you're not paying attention," Grace protested, snapping him back to the game. "Sorry, sweetheart. I was distracted by how well Gabriel is playing." After soccer, they played frisbee, and then Simone taught the children a clapping game she remembered from her own childhood. Jonathan sat on the blanket watching them, amazed by how seamlessly she had integrated into their family dynamic. Grace and Gabriel were completely comfortable with her, talking and laughing as if they had known her for years instead of weeks. "Miss Washington," Grace said during a quiet moment as they all rested on the blanket, "do you want to have kids someday?" Simone's face grew soft and wistful. "I would love to have children someday. I think being a mother would be the most wonderful thing in the world." "What kind of mom do you think you would be?" Gabriel asked, genuinely curious. Simone considered the question seriously. "I think I would be the kind of mom who reads bedtime stories every night, who listens when you have problems, and who always makes sure you know how much you're loved. I would want to be someone my children could trust and depend on, no matter what." Jonathan felt tears prick his eyes. She was describing exactly the kind of mother she had been during the brief time they had all been together, and exactly the kind of mother he could see her being now. "That sounds like a perfect mom," Grace said with satisfaction. "You would be a great mom," Gabriel added confidently. "You're already really good with kids." "Thank you," Simone said, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more to me than you know." As the afternoon wore on, Jonathan found himself completely relaxed for the first time in months. Watching Simone with his children, seeing how much joy she brought to their lives, he began to understand why Grace and Gabriel had been so determined to bring them together. She filled a gap in their family that he had not even realized existed. When it was time to pack up their picnic, both children expressed disappointment. "Can't we stay a little longer?" Grace asked hopefully. "The sun doesn't go down for hours," Gabriel added. "We should head home," Jonathan said gently. "Mrs. Patterson is making your favorite dinner tonight." "Miss Washington," Grace said suddenly, "would you like to come to dinner with us? Mrs. Patterson always makes extra food." Jonathan felt his breath catch. Having Simone in their home would make their relationship feel much more real and significant. "Oh, I couldn't impose," Simone said quickly. You've already been so generous with your time today. Please, Gabriel said, taking her hand. We really want you to come. Mrs. Patterson would love to meet you properly, Grace added. We've told her all about you. Simone looked uncertainly at Jonathan. If you're sure it wouldn't be too much trouble? It would be our pleasure, Jonathan said, meaning it completely. Mrs. Patterson loves having guests and the children would be thrilled. That evening, Jonathan's penthouse apartment was filled with laughter and conversation in a way it had not been since the twins came to live with him. Mrs. Patterson took an immediate liking to Simone, and the two women bonded over recipes and teaching strategies while the children showed Simone every corner of their home. This is my room, Grace announced proudly, giving Simone a tour of her pink and purple bedroom. And that's Gabriel's room across the hall. And this is Daddy's office, Gabriel added, leading them down the hallway. He works in here sometimes, but he always stops to help us with homework. Simone admired everything with genuine interest, asking questions about the children's artwork on the refrigerator and their book collection in the family room. She seemed particularly drawn to the family photos scattered throughout the apartment, studying them with an expression Jonathan could not quite read. Daddy, Grace said as they gathered in the living room after dinner, can Miss Washington help us with bedtime stories tonight? If she doesn't mind, Jonathan said, looking at Simone questioningly. I would love to, she replied immediately. The bedtime routine that followed was the most natural thing in the world. Simone helped Grace choose pajamas while Jonathan supervised Gabriel's teeth brushing. Then they all gathered in Grace's room for story time, with both children cuddled against Simone on the bed while she read from Charlotte's Web. Jonathan sat in the rocking chair beside the bed watching his family because that's what they felt like in that moment. A family. Complete and happy and right in a way that made his chest ache with longing. When the children finally fell asleep, Jonathan and Simone tiptoed out of the room and found themselves alone in the living room. The silence felt weighted with possibility and uncertainty. Thank you for today, Jonathan said quietly. The kids had a wonderful time. So did I, Simone replied. They're amazing children, Jonathan. You should be so proud. I am, he said, studying her face in the soft lamplight. Simone. Yes. I want you to know that whatever happened between us before, whatever went wrong, seeing you with Grace and Gabriel today, it felt right. It felt like how things should be. Simone's eyes filled with tears. It felt right to me too. They stood there looking at each other, years of pain and longing and hope swirling between them, both afraid to say too much and afraid to say too little. I should probably go, Simone said finally. It's getting late. Of course, Jonathan said, though he wanted to ask her to stay. As he walked her to the door, Simone turned back to look at him one more time. Jonathan, she said softly, thank you for giving me a chance to be part of their lives even in this small way. It means everything to me. After she left, Jonathan stood at his living room window, watching her car disappear into the night traffic. Grace and Gabriel's plan was working better than they could have imagined. He was falling in love with Simone all over again, and this time it felt even deeper and more real than before. He just hoped that when the truth finally came out, their second chance at love would be strong enough to survive it. 2 weeks later, Grace was searching through the closet in her father's study for construction paper when she found an old shoebox pushed far back behind a stack of business files. Curious, she pulled it out and carefully lifted the lid. Inside were photographs. Dozens of them, some in frames and some loose, all featuring people she recognized but in ways that made no sense. There was her father, looking younger and happier than she had ever seen him. And there was Miss Washington, but she was wearing a beautiful white dress and holding a bouquet of flowers while Daddy kissed her cheek. Grace's hands trembled as she picked up another photo. This one showed Miss Washington in a hospital bed, smiling tiredly while holding 2 tiny babies. Daddy sat beside her, his arms around both babies, looking like the happiest man in the world. Gabriel, Grace called in a shaky voice. Gabriel, come here right now. Her twin brother appeared in the doorway of the study, took one look at Grace's pale face and the scattered photographs, and immediately sat down beside her on the floor. What are those? He asked quietly. Grace held up the hospital photo with trembling fingers. I think Miss Washington is our mommy. Gabriel stared at the picture, his green eyes wide with shock. But that's impossible. Our mommy went to heaven when we were babies. Look, Grace said, spreading out more photos. Here's another one of Daddy and Miss Washington getting married. And here's one of her holding us when we were tiny. And look at this one. The photograph Grace held showed a family of 4 in a beautiful living room. Jonathan sat in an armchair with baby Gabriel on his lap while Simone sat nearby holding baby Grace. Everyone was laughing and they looked perfectly happy together. Gabriel picked up a loose photo that had fallen on the floor. It showed Simone sitting in a rocking chair, singing to two toddlers who were clearly Grace and Gabriel at about 2 years old. In the background they could see toys and furniture they vaguely remembered. "I remember this song," Gabriel whispered suddenly. "She used to sing it to us. Something about stars and dreams and being safe." Grace felt tears streaming down her face. "She used to braid my hair. I remember her hands being really gentle and she smelled like vanilla." "Why did Daddy tell us she went to heaven?" Gabriel asked, his voice breaking. "Why did he lie to us?" Before Grace could answer, they heard footsteps in the hallway. Both children quickly started gathering up the photographs, but they were not fast enough. Jonathan appeared in the doorway of his study and stopped dead when he saw them sitting on the floor surrounded by pictures of their family's past. "Grace, Gabriel, what are you doing?" "Daddy," Grace said, her voice small and scared, "why is Miss Washington in all these pictures with us?" Jonathan's face went completely white. He sank into his desk chair, looking suddenly much older than his 32 years. "Where did you find those?" he asked quietly. "In the closet," Gabriel said, clutching the rocking chair photo against his chest. "Daddy, is Miss Washington our real mommy?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Jonathan looked at his children's faces, saw the confusion and hurt and hope in their expressions, and knew there was no way to avoid the truth any longer. "Yes," he said simply. "Miss Washington is your mother." Both children stared at him in stunned silence. "But why?" Grace started, then stopped, overwhelmed by too many questions to ask at once. "Why did you tell us she was dead?" Gabriel finished, his voice stronger and more hurt than Grace had ever heard it. Jonathan knelt down on the floor beside them, his heart breaking at the pain in their faces. "I never told you she was dead, sweetheart. I said she went away and you were so young that you assumed. I should have corrected you. I should have found a better way to explain." "Where did she go?" Grace asked, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "Why did she leave us?" Gabriel added, and the betrayal in his voice made Jonathan want to gather both children in his arms and never let them go. "It's complicated," Jonathan said gently. "Mommy was scared about some things that were happening in our lives, and she thought the best way to protect you was to take you somewhere safe. But then why are we here with you instead of with her?" Grace asked logically. Jonathan struggled with how much truth to share with his 6-year-old children. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes when they're scared. Mommy made a choice that separated our family, and it took a long time for you to come back to me. Does she know we're her kids?" Gabriel asked, looking down at the hospital photo. "She knows," Jonathan admitted. "She recognized you right away. So she's been pretending this whole time?" Grace's voice rose with indignation. "She's been lying to us just like you did?" "We weren't trying to lie to you," Jonathan said desperately. "We were trying to figure out how to tell you the truth without hurting you." Gabriel stood up suddenly, still clutching the photograph. "I want to see her. I want to talk to her right now." "Gabriel?" "No," the little boy said with a determination that reminded Jonathan powerfully of Simone. "We've been trying to find you a wife, and it turns out you already had one. We've been trying to find someone to love us like a mommy, and our real mommy was there the whole time. This is crazy, Daddy." Grace stood up too, gathering several photos in her arms. "We're going to see Miss Washington. Mommy. Whatever we're supposed to call her now." "Children, wait," Jonathan said, but they were already marching toward the door with the righteous anger that only comes from discovering that the adults in your life have been keeping enormous secrets. "Are we going to live with her now?" Grace asked, stopping in the doorway. "Is that what happens next?" "I don't know," Jonathan said honestly. "We all need to talk together and figure out what's best for everyone." "What's best for everyone is being a family," Gabriel said matter-of-factly. "That's what we've been trying to make happen this whole time." 20 minutes later, Jonathan found himself driving toward Simone's apartment complex with two very determined children in his back seat. He had tried to convince them to wait, to let him call Simone first, to approach this revelation more gradually. But Grace and Gabriel were having none of it. "She needs to know that we know," Grace had declared. "And we need to know why she pretended not to remember us." Now, as they climbed the stairs to Simone's second-floor apartment, Jonathan wondered if he was making a terrible mistake. But looking at his children's faces, seeing their need for answers and resolution, he knew there was no other choice. Gabriel knocked on the door with small, determined fists. When Simone opened it, wearing casual clothes and looking surprised to see them, both children held up their photographs. "We know who you are," Grace said simply. Simone's face crumbled and she sank to her knees right there in the doorway, pulling both children into her arms as tears streamed down her face. "My babies," she whispered. "My beautiful, perfect babies. I have missed you every single day." "Why did you leave us?" Gabriel asked, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "Why didn't you tell us who you were?" Grace added, but she was hugging Simone just as tightly as her brother. "Because I was scared," Simone said honestly. "I was scared you wouldn't remember me. I was scared you wouldn't forgive me. I was scared I had lost the right to be your mommy." Jonathan stood behind his children, watching this reunion with a heart so full of conflicting emotions he thought it might burst. Pain and anger and love and hope all swirled together as he watched his family begin to heal. "But we love you," Grace said, pulling back to look at Simone's face. "We picked you to be Daddy's wife because you're the most wonderful person we know. We just didn't know you were already supposed to be our mommy," Gabriel added. Simone looked up at Jonathan over the children's heads, her eyes asking 1,000 questions he was not ready to answer. But looking at Grace and Gabriel, seeing them in their mother's arms where they belonged, Jonathan realized that ready or not, their family was about to change forever. The only question now was whether they could find a way to heal the wounds of the past and build something new and strong enough to last. 6 months later, Jonathan stood at the altar of the small chapel where he and Simone had first been married 8 years ago. This time, however, their wedding was very different. Grace stood to his right in a flowing pink dress, holding a bouquet of white roses and practically bouncing with excitement. Gabriel stood to his left in a tiny tuxedo that matched his father's, carrying the wedding rings on a satin pillow. The past 6 months had not been easy. After that emotional confrontation in Simone's apartment, the family had spent countless hours in counseling, learning to communicate honestly and work through years of pain and misunderstanding. Simone had explained everything, how she had become convinced that Jonathan's business rivals were targeting their family, how she had received threatening phone calls that mentioned the children by name, how her own paranoia and postpartum anxiety had made her believe that running away was the only way to keep Grace and Gabriel safe. Jonathan had shared his own pain, the agony of coming home to an empty house, the sleepless nights wondering if his family was alive, the way he had thrown himself into work to avoid dealing with his broken heart, the guilt he felt for not recognizing how frightened Simone had been. The children had been angry at first, hurt by the deception, confused by the complicated emotions of the adults in their lives. But with the help of Dr. Martinez, a family therapist who specialized in reunification, they had slowly begun to understand that sometimes people make mistakes out of love and fear, and that forgiveness was possible even when trust had been broken. The important thing, Dr. Martinez had told them during one particularly difficult session, is not what happened in the past, but what you choose to do going forward. You cannot change yesterday, but you can decide what tomorrow looks like. Grace and Gabriel had decided that tomorrow should look like a complete family. They had been adamant about the wedding, insisting that if their parents were going to be together, they needed to make it official. "We already found Daddy the perfect wife," Grace had announced during a family dinner 3 months ago. "Now we just need to make sure she stays. Forever and always," Gabriel had added seriously. "That's what families do." Now, as the wedding music began and Simone appeared at the back of the chapel, Jonathan felt his breath catch in his throat. She wore a simple ivory dress that flowed around her like water, and she carried a bouquet of the same white roses that Grace held. But it was her smile that took his breath away. It was radiant with hope and love and the quiet joy of a woman who had found her way home. As she walked down the aisle, her eyes were only for her family. She smiled at Grace, who waved excitedly despite Mrs. Patterson's earlier instructions about proper wedding behavior. She winked at Gabriel, who stood up straighter and puffed out his chest with pride. And when her gaze finally met Jonathan's, he saw in her eyes everything he had hoped to see: love, forgiveness, and the promise of a future they would build together. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, "we are gathered here today to witness the remarriage of Jonathan and Simone Hayes, and to celebrate the reunion of a family that has been apart too long." The ceremony was short and sweet, filled with personal vows that had been written with input from Grace and Gabriel. "Simone," Jonathan said, his voice thick with emotion, 8 years ago, I promised to love you in sickness and in health, for richer and for poorer, for better and for worse. I thought I understood what those words meant then, but now I know that love is not just about the easy times. It's about fighting for each other even when we make mistakes. It's about forgiveness and second chances. It's about building something stronger from the broken pieces of what came before." He paused, looking at their children, who were listening with rapt attention. "You gave me the most precious gifts in the world when you gave me Grace and Gabriel. You taught me what it means to be a father. And now, I want to spend the rest of my life showing you what it means to be a family. Simone wiped away tears as she began her own vows. Jonathan, Grace, Gabriel, she said, including the children in her promises, I made mistakes in the past that caused all of us pain. I let fear make me believe that running away was the same thing as protecting the people I loved. I learned that love is not about shielding each other from every difficulty, but about facing challenges together. She knelt down so she was at eye level with the children. Grace and Gabriel, you are the lights of my life. You are kind and brave and smart and funny, and I am so proud to be your mother. I promise to always be honest with you, to listen when you need to talk, and to love you no matter what. I promise to read you bedtime stories and help with homework and cheer at every soccer game and school play. Standing back up, she looked at Jonathan with eyes full of love. And Jonathan, I promise to be your partner in everything. To support your dreams while sharing my own. To laugh with you and cry with you and build a life that is big enough for all the love we have to give. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Grace and Gabriel cheered so loudly that the entire congregation burst into laughter and applause. The reception was held in the fellowship hall of the chapel, with just close family and friends. Mrs. Patterson had outdone herself with the catering, and the children's grandparents had flown in from 3 different states to witness the reunion. I have to admit, Jonathan's mother said as she watched Grace and Gabriel teach Simone the family's traditional anniversary dance, I never thought I'd see this day. But looking at the 4 of you together, it's clear that some families are worth fighting for. As the evening wound down, the newly reunited Hayes family returned to their penthouse apartment. Grace and Gabriel were exhausted but happy, full of cake and the excitement of having attended their very own parents' wedding. Mommy, Grace said as Simone tucked her into bed, will you sing me the star song? Simone's eyes filled with happy tears. Of course, sweetheart. As her mother's voice filled the room with the same lullaby she had sung years ago, Grace felt a completeness she had not even known was missing from her life. Gabriel, listening from his own bed across the hall, smiled sleepily. Operation Find Daddy Love had been more successful than he and Grace had ever dreamed possible. Later that night, as Jonathan and Simone stood on their balcony looking out at the city lights, Simone felt Jonathan's arms wrap around her from behind. Do you think we can make it work this time? She asked softly. I think, Jonathan said, kissing the top of her head, that we have 2 very determined children who will make sure we do. Simone laughed, leaning back against his chest. They certainly are persistent when they set their minds to something. Just like their mother, Jonathan said warmly. 1 year later, as the Hayes family celebrated their first wedding anniversary, Simone had one more surprise to share. Grace and Gabriel, now 7 years old and thriving in their complete family, listened with wide eyes as their parents explained that they were going to be big siblings. A baby? Grace breathed, her eyes lighting up with wonder. A real baby that we get to help take care of? Gabriel asked excitedly. A real baby, Simone confirmed, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. Due in the spring. As Grace and Gabriel danced around the living room with excitement, Jonathan pulled Simone close and marveled at how perfectly their life had come together. Their family had been broken and scattered, but love and determination and the innocent wisdom of 2 children had brought them home to each other. Sometimes the best fairy tale endings were the ones that came after the darkest chapters, stronger and more beautiful for having survived the storms. The Hayes family was living proof that love truly could conquer all, especially when guided by the pure hearts of children who simply wanted their daddy to be happy.